Hi everyone, this is Thomas King. And to finish off lesson 0, and then we can move on to the real stuff, I'd like to just explain the special moves in chess, and of course the objective of chess, something that I haven't explained yet. So you might have noticed in the video entitled The Movement of the Pieces that I did not cover the movement of a rather noteworthy piece. It's the most common piece on the chessboard, and it's the least valuable. It's this guy here, the pawn. And there's a reason I didn't cover the movement of this piece, and that reason is, the movement of this piece is fucking ridiculous. I apologize for swearing there, but it really is. The way that it can move varies so much that I thought it would fit better into the special moves, video than into the movement of the pieces video. Now, why is this? Why would I put the movement of a particular piece in the category of special moves rather than the movement of the pieces, something that it really should be in? Well, the answer is actually rather simple. Pawns move... No, they don't move in this ridiculous L shape. They move one square forward. A pretty simple way to move, if you ask me. And I think that when making chess, the makers of chess said, yeah, that is pretty simple. In fact, it's a little too simple. And so, rather than just this, on the first move, pawns can not only choose to move one square forward, but they can also choose to move 2 squares forward. It's an interesting rule. It's still a rather simplistic piece to understand, but it does get worse. Now, if you're learning how the pieces move, then I want you to take a look at this position here. Now, we know that pawns move 1 square forward. So, when they take, which piece can white take? This piece here on the diagonal, or this piece directly in front of the pawn? And as you might have already figured, you can only take on a diagonal. Pawns take on a diagonal, but only 1 square. If there was a pawn on f6, then we wouldn't be able to take that. It'd be safe. So, to make things more complicated, pawns take on the diagonal. But it still gets more complicated. This piece that ought to be the most simplistic on the chessboard becomes a nightmare to learn the rules. And this happens when we introduce a rule known as promotion. Now, when a pawn reaches the end of the board, that ought to be a pretty miserable situation, because pawns can't move backwards. They can only move 1 square forward. So, once a pawn reaches the end of the board, it can't control any squares. Here on a7, it controls b8. Not a8, because remember, pawns don't take forward. And once it reaches a8, all it can do is occupy a square and inhibit the movement of its own pieces. That's it. And so, the makers of chess felt sorry for the pawn when deciding the movement of this pawn, because rather than just accepting that a pawn on its final rank sucks, they made it such that as soon as a pawn reaches the final rank of the board, note how when I try to do this in Skid, the option of a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight comes up. Well, that's because this pawn can choose to turn into either a knight, a bishop, a rook, or a queen. So normally you'll turn it into a queen. This is known as promotion. The pawn has been promoted from a measly peasant, which is what pawns represent in chess, to a queen. You can't promote it to a king, and even if you could, that would be a serious liability because you'd have two kings to look after instead of one. But you can turn it into anything you want, with the obvious exception of a queen, of a king, or of course a pawn. And you'd think that would be the last of the special moves involving the pawn, but remarkably, it isn't. Now let's just take, for example, this position here. Now, this pawn means that if white plays g3, then black can play h takes g3. This pawn cannot move without being allowed to be taken. Of course, in this case, it's a terrible move. I mean, you just drop the rook. To take on g3, that is. But, what pawns on their first move can also move 2 squares forward. And this pawn's been sneaky. It knows that this pawn doesn't want it to get past the g3. Get past g3. And so it just skips it, taking advantage of its temporary power. And although they were very kind to the pawn when designing the promotion rule, when designing the en passant rule, as it is known, which is French for passing, I believe. They're actually being rather cruel, at least to the pawn trying to be sneaky, because here black can take the pawn anyway. There's no pawn on g4, on g3 rather, and yet we took the pawn on g3. So it's ridiculous, but that's actually how you're actually allowed to do this. It's known as en passant, and it's an official chess rule. In every official chess game, you can play this. Okay, so finally, we reach the end of special moves involving pawn.